Officer Jose Lopez had encountered many unsettling situations during his years on the force, but that night, on what seemed like a routine patrol, was unlike any other. Near the end of October, a chilly breeze announced the coming winter. The radio interrupted the silence with a report, a possible disturbance at an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The property had a dark history. Years before, a homicide had taken place there, leaving the house uninhabited and surrounded by rumors. Neighbors whispered about strange activities, though none dared to approach. When Jose arrived, the house stood in eerie silence. The trees around it seemed to lean inward, creating an oppressive atmosphere. His flashlight barely penetrated the thick darkness as he walked toward the front steps, which creaked under his weight. Jose hesitated before opening the door. His instincts urged him to turn back, but his duty was to investigate. He turned the knob, and the door opened with a groan, revealing an interior as decrepit as the exterior. The air inside was heavy, as if the place had been shut for decades. His flashlight flickered. Jose tapped it with his hand, managing to keep a weak beam of light, just enough to reveal the dusty contours of the furniture. "Dispatch, Officer Lopez. I'm in the house. There's no sign of activity, but I'll do a quick sweep," he said, hoping for a response. But only static came through. Despite his discomfort, he continued his inspection. The first room was empty, with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. In the kitchen, dishes remained in the sink, a forgotten testimony of those who had once lived there. As he moved down the dark hallway, he saw a slightly open door that made him stop. Something about that door put him on alert. He approached slowly, listening to a barely perceptible sound. It sounded like breathing. His heart began to race. He cautiously pushed the door open, discovering a staircase leading down to the basement. The cold air enveloped him as he descended, his flashlight casting shifting shadows as he moved. Upon reaching the basement, an unbearable stench filled his nose, and his flashlight went out, leaving him in complete darkness. The sense of danger was tangible. He tried using his radio again, but all he heard was static. And then a voice faintly emerged over the receiver, but it wasn't from dispatch. "Jose, come closer." A chill ran through his body. The voice was soft, almost mocking but distorted, as if filtered through an old device. "Who's there?" Jose shouted, his voice betraying the fear that enveloped him. No one responded. Instead, he heard footsteps behind him. He quickly turned, pointing his flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, circling him as if something were stalking him. Suddenly, the flashlight came back on. In the darkest corner of the basement, Jose saw something. A man was standing, facing away from him with a gaunt figure. "Sir, I need you to turn around slowly," he ordered, trying to remain calm despite the terror consuming him. The man didn't move. Jose took a step toward him. "Sir." Suddenly, the man turned violently. His face was battered and disfigured, and a guttural scream erupted from his mouth, echoing off the basement walls. Jose stepped back in horror, realizing there was a body at his feet. It was the body of another officer, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. Panic overtook him. He bolted up the stairs as fast as he could, with the echo of the man's footsteps close behind. He rushed through the house, barely feeling the floor beneath his feet as he ran toward the exit. Upon reaching his patrol car, the tranquil night enveloped him once more. No footsteps, no screams, just silence. Jose slumped against his car, trembling as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch!" "I need backup now," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. The radio crackled with a response. "Lopez, where are you?" "I'm at the house, the abandoned house outside town," he replied, still looking at the place. But they interrupted him. "Lopez, there's no abandoned house in that area. What are you talking about?" Jose froze. He turned to look at the property, but the house was no longer there. The land was empty, just trees and weeds. There was no house, no porch, no basement. His mind couldn't process what had just happened, but he could still smell the stench of decay in the air, and the image of the officer's body on the ground continued to haunt his memory. He looked toward the trees, and then he saw it. In the distance, the disfigured man watched him from the shadows, grinning in a macabre way. Jose knew then that the nightmare hadn't ended. Officer Ernesto Ramirez had always shown unshakable composure under pressure. However, during a nighttime patrol around the town, He would face a situation that would test all his years of experience. The place he was sent to, known locally as Dead Man's Pass, had been the site of several accidents and disappearances. Ernesto had never believed in superstitions, but that night, a strange unease crept over him. It was a cold night in November, and the fog descended like a shroud, covering the road and the surrounding woods. The headlights of his patrol car barely illuminated a few meters ahead, and the silence was unsettling. Just as he began to relax, his radio signaled, "Officer Ramirez, we have a report of a stranded vehicle at Dead Man's Pass. Check it out." Ernesto answered the call and headed to the specified location. As he rounded a bend, he saw an old sedan parked on the roadside, its emergency lights blinking weakly through the fog. He stopped his patrol car and got out, pulling his coat tighter to combat the cold. The air was colder than expected, with a sense of oppression hanging in the atmosphere. As he approached the sedan, his flashlight illuminated an empty interior with the driver's door open. The strangest thing was the smell, a metallic, acrid odor that he recognized as blood. Alarmed, he called out, "Is anyone there?" There was no response. Circling the car, he discovered a trail of footprints leading into the nearby woods. He clenched his jaw, knowing he had to follow the trail. His radio, which had been working until then, began to fail, emitting only static. "Officer Ramirez, I'm going to investigate," he reported, but the static persisted. Ernesto decided to follow the footprints. With each step into the dense forest, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though something were watching him. The branches crackled under his feet and his breathing grew heavier with the cold that enveloped him. The footprints led him to a small clearing where an old, dilapidated cabin stood. The door, barely hanging from its hinges, was ajar. Ernesto drew his weapon and approached cautiously. The fog around the cabin seemed thicker, and the stench of decay struck him immediately as he peered inside. "Hello?" he said, his voice barely a whisper in the darkness. Entering, his flashlight illuminated chaos. Dusty furniture, peeling walls, and on the floor, a mound covered with a blood-stained sheet. Ernesto approached cautiously and, with a trembling hand, lifted the edge of the sheet. Beneath it lay a dead man, his body bloated and his face frozen in an expression of utter terror. He stepped back instantly, terror twisting his stomach. He had to get out of there. Just as he was about to leave, he heard a sound. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, coming from somewhere in the cabin. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling as he drew his weapon. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. Then a low, mocking whisper seemed to come from all directions. "Officer Ramirez, you shouldn't have come." Ernesto's heart pounded in his chest. Something was wrong. With his instincts screaming to flee, he turned and ran from the cabin. The whispers followed him, mixed with the crunch of branches under his feet. Something or someone was chasing him, but he couldn't see anything. Upon reaching his patrol car, he threw himself into the driver's seat and shut the door, trembling. His hands struggled to fit the key into the ignition, and just as he started the car, he looked in the rearview mirror. Something stood at the edge of the woods, watching him. It was a tall, thin figure with glowing eyes that followed him with a disturbing intensity. He sped off without looking back, driving at full speed until he reached the station. When he recounted what had happened, the search teams found the abandoned car, but no trace of the cabin or the body he had seen. Every trace had simply disappeared into the fog. The only thing that remained was Ernesto's terror and the uneasy feeling that those glowing eyes still watched him, even miles away. Officer Marina Salazar had years of experience on the night shift, facing all kinds of situations. However, nothing had prepared her for what she would experience that night. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, she received a call about an abandoned car on a rural road. The area, known for being isolated, wasn't particularly famous, but Marina knew that any incident in such a place could be dangerous. Upon arrival, the fog was thick, swirling beneath the beams of her patrol car's headlights. The abandoned vehicle, a blue sedan, sat on the side of the road with the driver's door open. Marina reported her arrival to Central, but the radio emitted static before a voice responded with a warning. "Be careful out there, officer. That area has a bad reputation." Puzzled, Marina tried to respond, but the radio cut out. Not paying much attention to the comment, she got out of her car and approached the sedan, her flashlight illuminating the interior. The car was messy with food scraps and clothes scattered across the seats. What caught her attention was an old notebook lying on the passenger seat with hastily scribbled pages. Among the notes, she noticed disturbing references to being watched from the woods and not being able to escape the road. Though strange, she continued with her inspection. Suddenly, a soft sound like leaves crunching came from the woods at the side of the road. Marina quickly turned her head toward the sound, aiming her flashlight into the trees. "Hello?" she called, her voice firm despite her growing unease. There was no response, just the whisper of the wind through the branches and the murmur of the fog. She advanced a bit more, but soon the fog became so dense that she could barely see a few meters ahead. The bad feeling in her chest grew. She returned to her patrol car to report the situation, but the radio continued to emit only static. As she wondered what to do next, something caught her attention. A figure at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the dimness of the fog. It was tall, thin, and seemed to be watching her from a distance. Marina instinctively reached for her weapon and shouted, "Step out and show yourself!" The figure remained still for a moment before vanishing into the trees, as if the fog itself had swallowed it. Marina hesitated for a moment but decided to investigate, venturing into the woods. As she moved forward, the air grew colder. The ground felt more unstable and the smell of dampness intensified. Finally, she reached a clearing where a ruined cabin stood in the center. The footprints in the ground led to the cabin. Marina drew her weapon and approached cautiously, pushing open the door, which creaked as it opened. The inside was dark with broken furniture covered in dust. A fetid smell filled her nose as her flashlight swept the room. On the floor in the back of the cabin, a mound covered by a blood-stained blanket caught her attention. Lifting the blanket, Marina discovered a man's body, clearly dead for days, with deep wounds and a face frozen in terror. Overwhelmed, she stepped back, barely containing her panic. Then she heard a sound, slow footsteps coming from somewhere inside the cabin. "Who's there?" she shouted, her weapon at the ready. The footsteps stopped, followed by a whisper. "You shouldn't be here, officer." Marina turned her head in all directions but saw no one. Fear swelled inside her, and with her heart pounding, she decided it was time to leave. She ran to the door, but something stopped her. A shadowy figure, tall and thin, stood in the doorway, blocking her exit. Marina raised her weapon and fired, but the figure didn't move. It seemed immune to any attack. Desperate, Marina ran to the window, smashing it to escape. The sound of shattering glass echoed in the stillness as she jumped to the cold, damp ground. Barely catching her breath, she started running back to her patrol car, feeling as though something was closing the distance between them with every step. When she finally reached her patrol car, hands shaking, she started the engine and sped down the road, her heart about to burst from her chest. She didn't look back until she was miles away. Only then did she dare glance in the rearview mirror, but she saw nothing. The road was empty, save for the fog that still covered everything. Marina reported the incident upon reaching the station, but when her colleagues went to the place, they found no trace of the cabin or the body. All that remained was the disturbing memory of that dark figure, which seemed to have followed her from the edge of the darkness. Officer Ernesto Suarez had served more than a decade on the police force, facing all kinds of situations, but nothing had prepared him for the call he received on a stormy night. He was informed of a disturbance in an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place with a dark reputation among locals. Rumors said the house was cursed and that children and young people dared each other to approach it, though none stayed long. Neighbors often reported strange noises, lights flickering in the windows and shadows that seemed to move in the yard. However, for Ernesto, it was just another call. The patrol car moved along a narrow path as the torrential rain battered the windshield, reducing visibility. The headlights barely pierced the darkness of the storm. Upon arrival, the house loomed like a sinister shadow, with broken windows and a porch weighed down by the years. A sense of unease washed over him as he looked at the house, flashlight in hand. He tried to report to Central, but the storm interfered with the radio. With no other choice, he pulled up his hood and got out of the car. The house appeared abandoned, but neighbors had reported lights inside. As he reached the door, which was slightly open, a stale air from inside flooded out. Ernesto pushed it gently with his hand, and it creaked open. His flashlight illuminated a space covered in dust, with old furniture and cobwebs in every corner. Yet there was something in the air that made him nervous, as if someone had been there recently. He walked slowly down the hallway, following his flashlight over fresh mud footprints that led deeper into the house. His heart began to pound as he followed them until he reached a door that led to the basement. From below, he could hear what sounded like whispers. Ernesto hesitated, but he knew he had to continue the investigation. Pushing open the door, he descended the stairs cautiously as the air grew denser and colder. Upon reaching the basement, he found a larger space than he had expected. In the center, on a stone slab, he saw dark stains that looked like dried blood. Before he could process what he was seeing, he heard a loud bang from the floor above, followed by footsteps creaking on the wooden floor. Wasting no time, Ernesto hurried up the stairs, gun drawn. When he reached the hallway, he found a figure standing there, a woman with her back to him. She was soaked from the rain, with tangled hair and clothes clinging to her body. She stood still, her head tilted toward the floor. "Ma'am," Ernesto called, trying to stay calm. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't respond or move. Something in her stillness alarmed him even more. He took a few steps forward, keeping his gun ready. "I need you to turn around slowly," he insisted. In an unnatural way, the woman began to turn toward him, revealing a pale, gaunt face covered in wounds. Her eyes were dark, and her twisted smile sent a chill through him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered in a raspy, wavering voice. Ernesto backed away, aiming his gun. The storm continued to rage outside, and suddenly the power went out, leaving the house in complete darkness. Only the intermittent beam of his flashlight kept him connected to reality. Breathing heavily, he reached for his radio, but it was still out of service. As he moved toward the exit, he heard footsteps behind him. He quickly turned, shining his flashlight down the hallway, but there was no one there. However, the sound persisted, surrounding him. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed near the door, and the woman's figure appeared again, this time only a few meters away, blocking his exit. Panic overtook Ernesto. Without hesitation, he ran for the porch, stumbling as the woman's figure seemed to draw closer. His mind screamed for him to escape. As soon as he felt the cold rain hit his face, he jumped into the patrol car and started the engine. Without looking back, he stepped on the gas, speeding away from the house, his heart racing. Only when he reached the station, soaked and trembling, was he able to recount what had happened. His colleagues listened, incredulous. The next day, they sent a patrol to the site, but found nothing out of the ordinary. There was no trace of the woman, nor any sign of what Ernesto had experienced. Everything remained shrouded in mystery, just another story among the many surrounding that house. From that night on, Ernesto never patrolled that area again, but in his loneliest nights, he could still hear the echo of footsteps behind him, and the disturbing smile of the woman who seemed to have followed him beyond the storm. Officer Camila Reyes had handled many strange calls in her career, but the one that came on Halloween night was different. Dispatch reported a possible break-in at the old, decrepit Miller house, a place known for its terrible condition. Teenagers often sneaked into the house just for fun, though most left quickly upon realizing how unsafe it was. The place had been abandoned for years and over time had become a magnet for thrill seekers, or simply anyone looking for a place to hide. When Camilla arrived on the scene, the house stood alone on the outskirts of town, almost covered by overgrown vegetation. Its broken windows seemed to stare back at her in the darkness. The wind whistled through the trees, scattering leaves that swirled across the ground. The house was on the verge of collapse. The wood on the walls looked rotten, and the porch visibly sagged. The scene didn't inspire much confidence. She stepped out of her patrol car, the crunch of gravel under her boots her only companion. She shone her flashlight over the property, scanning the weeds and vines climbing the walls. Nothing seemed out of place, at least at first glance. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reyes at the Miller house. I'm going in to investigate," she reported, but received only static in response. She shook her head and put away the radio. The lack of signal didn't surprise her, as the place was in a dead zone. She approached the front door, which was barely ajar. There were no signs of forced entry, which indicated the intruders had likely taken advantage of the house's decrepit state. The door creaked as she opened it, and as she stepped inside, cold, damp air enveloped her. The interior was in even worse shape than the exterior. Dust covered everything, and the smell of mold and decay was overpowering. Her flashlight illuminated old furniture covered with sheets, The place had been abandoned for years, yet everything remained in an eerie state of suspension, as if someone might return at any moment. "Police?" Camilla called out, her voice echoing through the empty house. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. However, a soft and steady sound caught her attention, a scratching noise coming from the second floor. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to stay calm. It was probably just an animal or the wind moving a loose window. She decided to investigate. She climbed the stairs, which creaked under her weight, and the scratching sound grew louder. When she reached the top, she shone her flashlight down a long hallway lined with closed doors. The noise was coming from the last door on the right. Gripping the flashlight tighter, she moved toward it. The atmosphere grew heavier, and although she tried to rationalize the situation, her discomfort kept increasing. The door was slightly open. Camilla gently pushed it and stepped inside. The room was small and empty, save for a chair near a broken window. The scratching had stopped, but now she heard something even more unsettling, a barely audible whisper. She looked around, scanning every corner of the room. She saw no one. Her radio crackled, making her jump. Static flooded the channel again, and for a moment she thought she heard a voice, distorted and unclear. She tried to respond, but the signal was still dead. As she shone her flashlight on the floor, she found something that made her stop. Deep, scratched words carved into the wood, as if someone had clawed at it in desperation. "Help." Camilla felt a knot in her stomach. She crouched down to examine the marks more closely. Noticing they looked recent, the air felt colder and the smell of dampness was even stronger. Just as she was standing up, she heard a creak behind her. She turned around quickly but saw no one. The tension in the air was palpable, and the whisper seemed to have returned, though more softly. She decided it was time to leave. As she made her way toward the door, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the broken window. A figure standing in the doorway, motionless and watching her from the shadows. Adrenaline surged through her as she turned immediately, drawing her weapon. But the doorway was empty. No one was there. Confused and afraid, she hurried toward the stairs. As she descended, she heard a loud slam from the main entrance. She ran to the door to try to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was jammed. Panic started to rise within her. She needed to find another way out. She ran toward the kitchen in search of a back door, but when she got there, she found that the structure was too damaged and blocked. The place was a maze of ruined rooms, and her only option was to return the way she had come. She went back to the main hallway and with some effort managed to unstick the front door, finally freeing herself from the house. The cold night air hit her immediately as she ran to her patrol car. Only once inside, with the door slammed shut and the engine on, did she feel a slight sense of relief. She looked back at the house in the distance. From the outside, it looked harmless, but something very wrong had happened inside. Camilla returned to the station that night, still trembling. She recounted what had happened, but she dismissed it as an encounter with an intruder who had managed to escape. It was never clarified who or what had been in the house, but from that night on, Camilla never patrolled near the Miller house again. Officer Mark Jacobs had always been skeptical, never one to believe in ghosts or the paranormal. For him, every case had a logical explanation. One rainy night, he received a call about suspicious activity at the Thompson Asylum, an abandoned place known to be dangerous. The asylum had closed after a fire years ago, and since then, people claimed it was used as a shelter by the homeless and sometimes criminals. Jacobs assumed it was either teenagers causing trouble or someone seeking refuge from the cold. When he arrived at the asylum, the building looked imposing under the storm, its ruined facade and broken windows letting the wind whistle through. The storm made the entire place seem more menacing than it truly was. Jacobs parked his car in front of the main doors, which hung off their rusty hinges. He adjusted his raincoat, grabbed his flashlight and radio, and walked toward the building. "Dispatch Officer Jacobs at the Thompson Asylum. I'm going to check the area," he reported, but only heard static. The storm must have been interfering with the signal. Jacobs walked down the main hallway, his flashlight illuminating the cracked old tiles. Broken medical equipment and debris littered the floor, signs that the place had been untouched for years. The idea that someone might be living there put him on high alert. He checked several rooms, all empty. Some still had old beds and restraints. reminders of what had once been a psychiatric hospital. At the end of a long hallway, he noticed one of the doors was slightly open, catching his attention. As he got closer, he saw that the door led to a large room with a rusted gurney at the center. Patient files and piles of papers were scattered across the floor around it. He cautiously entered the room, scanning with his flashlight. Then he heard a faint noise behind him, like the creak of a floorboard. Jacobs quickly turned around, hand on his gun. "Is someone there?" he called out, but received no answer. Moving carefully toward the door, it suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping him inside. His instincts told him someone else was in the building. As he tried to open the door, Jacobs heard quick footsteps in the hallway. He wasn't alone. Heart pounding, he yanked at the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the faint sound of laughter from somewhere nearby. Someone was toying with him. Finally, he managed to open the door and stepped into the hallway. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the asylum, everything was eerily silent. As he moved forward, he heard another noise, as if someone were moving among the shadows. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridor, and then he saw it. A hunched figure, probably a homeless person or someone hiding from the law, was quickly moving down the hallway. Jacobs gave chase, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The intruder was fast and seemed to know the building well, but Jacobs was determined not to let him get away. Reaching an intersection in the corridors, he heard a door open and ran toward it. When he got there, the door shut forcefully. Pushing it open again, he found himself in a small service room with the intruder crouched in a corner. "Police, don't move," Jacobs shouted, shining his flashlight. The man, filthy with torn clothes, slowly raised his hands. He was a homeless man, likely living in the asylum for days. The man muttered incoherently about not being able to leave, about others who came at night and chased him. Jacobs, though skeptical, could see the man probably suffered from some kind of mental illness. With the man in custody, Jacobs left the building. The storm was beginning to subside, and the fresh air helped him regain his composure. He knew the asylum was dangerous due to its state of abandonment, but this time it had just been a case of someone seeking shelter. Still, as he drove away, he couldn't shake the thought of the sounds he'd heard, the sensation of being watched. Jacobs never mentioned to anyone the unease he felt that night. He didn't believe in the paranormal, but something about Thompson Asylum lingered in his mind, as if the place held secrets he had yet to discover. Officer Hector Salinas had been on the force for more than a decade, and though he'd seen many strange situations, he didn't believe in superstitions. However, Hollow Creek Bridge, deep in the forest, always had a bad reputation. People talked about accidents and disappearances, attributing the tragedies to unknown causes, though Salinas thought everything had a logical explanation. One night, he received an unusual call. A driver had seen a woman standing on the bridge, apparently in distress, and Salinas was sent to investigate. It was a thick, foggy night. When he arrived at the bridge, the mist enveloped everything, making the air dense and cold. The headlights from his car barely pierced the darkness, and beyond them was only a dense wall of fog. Salinas parked near the entrance of the bridge and turned off the engine, staying still for a moment to listen. The creek below was silent, with only the faint sound of water under the heavy fog. He stepped out of his patrol car, feeling the moisture settle on his skin, and turned on his flashlight. He swept the light along the bridge's structure but saw no sign of the woman the driver had mentioned. "Dispatch Officer Salinas at Hollow Creek Bridge, no sign of the woman," he said into his radio, but only static replied. He tried adjusting the dial, but the static persisted. Sighing, he tucked the radio back into his belt and started walking onto the bridge. The wooden planks creaked under his boots as he advanced, and the mist swirled around him like thick smoke. His flashlight barely cut through the fog, allowing him only a vague view of the trees on the other side. When he reached the center of the bridge, he stopped, a growing discomfort building in him. Slowly, he turned in a circle, shining his flashlight, but there was nothing, just mist. Then, he heard it. A faint sobbing sound, barely audible, coming from the other end of the bridge. "Hello?" Salinas called out, his voice breaking the silence. "Are you all right?" The sobbing continued, growing louder as he moved toward the sound. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he tried to see through the fog, but the bridge seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if he'd never reached the end. He should have reached the other side by now, but no matter how far he walked, it stayed out of reach. "Hello?" he called again, his unease turning to worry. The sobbing, which initially seemed to come from one direction, now surrounded him, enveloping him, coming from all directions. Then he saw her. A figure emerged from the mist, standing at the edge of the bridge with her back toward him. It was a woman wearing a long coat, her wet hair hanging messily over her shoulders. She was still, staring toward the water. Salinas felt a knot in his stomach. Something wasn't right. "I'm with the police. Do you need help?" he said, approaching cautiously. The woman didn't respond or move. The sobbing softened but didn't disappear. Salinas stopped a few meters away, close enough to make her out through the mist, but something about her posture unnerved him. She didn't seem natural, like she was on the verge of collapse. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around so I can help you," he said firmly. There was a long silence before the woman began to turn slowly. In the light of his flashlight, Salinas saw her face. It was gaunt, with deep circles under her eyes and an expression of utter despair. She looked ill. Suddenly, she stopped sobbing and in a shaky voice whispered, "I shouldn't have come here." Before Salinas could react, the woman took a step toward the edge of the bridge, leaning dangerously forward. The officer rushed forward just in time, grabbing her arm and pulling her back from the edge. She was trembling, her eyes filled with terror, as though she'd seen something worse than he could imagine. Salinas guided her back to his patrol car, trying to calm her down. "Come on, I'll take you somewhere safe," he said as he helped her into the car. On the way to the station, the woman kept repeating the same phrase, her voice low and shaky. "I shouldn't have come here. I never should have come here." That night, as Salinas filled out his report at the station, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen on the bridge. It wasn't a ghost or a supernatural figure, but the terror in the woman's eyes was real. Something had driven her to the brink of despair. And although Salinas didn't believe in the paranormal, he understood that something deeper, maybe psychological or related to her past, was at play. Officer Lorena Perez was no stranger to night patrols. The silence of the city after midnight often gave her a sense of tranquility, a break amid the daily chaos. However, there was one call that always made her uncomfortable: the old Monteverde Mall. The mall had been abandoned for years after the local economy collapsed and stores shut down. Over time, it became a haven for vandals and the homeless. Most calls related to the place were for minor disturbances, and it often fell to officers like Lorena to chase them away. That cold, foggy night, she received a call that put her on alert. A security guard at a nearby construction site reported seeing lights flickering inside the mall. His voice trembled over the radio, and there was something in his tone that unnerved Lorena. "Someone's inside," said the guard. "I saw something moving." Although Lorena wasn't easily frightened, the call made her tense. She drove to the location where the Monteverde Mall loomed dark and desolate in the distance, barely visible through the thick fog. It looked as though the building was being swallowed by the mist, its shadows distorted and deformed by her headlights. As she got out of her car, the damp air stung her skin. The mall's glass doors were still intact, though dirty and covered in dust. It didn't look like anyone had forced entry recently, but the guard's report echoed in her mind. Something was moving inside. "Dispatch Officer Perez at Monteverde. I'm going in to investigate," she informed through her radio, which replied only with static. Her footsteps echoed as she entered the mall. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the crunch of the floor beneath her boots. The air, dense and damp, smelled of mold and dust. As she walked, mannequins in the abandoned store windows, covered in dust and tangled in cobwebs, seemed to watch her silently. Something about those forgotten mannequins unnerved her, as though they were waiting to move at any moment. A faint sound made her stop abruptly. It sounded like the wind, but there were no drafts in the building. The sound repeated, clearer this time, and Lorena felt it was coming from one of the large stores, a former department store. She drew her flashlight and moved toward the source of the noise, her right hand close to her gun. "Hello?" she called. "Police, if anyone's here, come out now." There was no response, only the echo of her own voice. She advanced to the store's entrance, and her flashlight caught a slight movement. Someone or something was moving among the empty shelves. Lorena's heart began to beat faster as she raised her gun, aiming into the darkness. "Come out where I can see you," she ordered firmly. She cautiously moved toward the back of the store, her flashlight sweeping over the empty shelves. Then she saw it, a small, hunched figure hiding among the debris. It was a child, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with tattered, dirty clothes. The child stood with his back to her, unmoving, his head down and hair disheveled, covering his face. "Are you all right?" Lorena asked, lowering her weapon slightly but keeping her flashlight on the child. "How did you get in here?" The child didn't respond or move. Lorena felt a strange sense of unease. She took another step closer, but then the child slowly turned his head toward her, revealing an eerily calm expression. Without a word, the child sprang up and ran toward the back of the store, disappearing into the darkness. Lorena quickly followed, her flashlight illuminating her path. But when she reached the back of the store, the child was gone. She looked around, but there was no visible exit. It was impossible for him to have vanished so quickly. The air felt heavier and a sense of alarm overwhelmed her. Then from deep within the store she heard a low sound, a deep growl echoing in the darkness. Her instinct screamed at her to leave. This wasn't a lost child. Something else was in there. She spun on her heels and ran toward the exit, her flashlight trembling in her hand as the sound followed her, drawing closer. Outside, the cold night air hit her like a wave of relief. She reached her patrol car and slammed the door shut, starting the engine. When she looked back, the Monteverde Mall's doors remained closed, the building dark and silent as if nothing had happened. But Lorena knew something was inside, something that wasn't normal. Back at the station, she tried to write her report, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't explain what she'd seen or the sense of danger she'd experienced. In the following nights, that feeling of being watched lingered. Sometimes, she thought she saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision and heard strange sounds in the dark. She knew that something from Monteverde had followed her, something that wasn't going to let her go. Officer Marco Herrera responded to many unsettling calls during his time on the force, but none left as deep a mark on him as the one he received on a cold autumn night. The dispatcher's voice trembled as she relayed the details. A terrified woman had reported strange noises coming from her basement, scratching, whispers, and something else she couldn't describe. Although she insisted the house was empty, the sounds continued night after night, growing ever more intense. The house, located in an isolated area on the outskirts of town, was an old structure surrounded by trees. When Herrera arrived, the woman was waiting for him at the door, pale and trembling, with glassy eyes filled with fear. "I swear, officer," she whispered, "there's something down there. I hear it every night. It's not the pipes and it's not the house settling. It's something or someone." Herrera nodded calmly, trying to reassure her. He had been a police officer for 15 years and had responded to enough calls of this kind to know that it was often animals or old pipes causing the noises. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but he always took each call seriously. He followed her down a narrow hallway leading to an old wooden door. The woman didn't dare approach it any closer, stopping in the doorway and pointing with a trembling hand toward the basement door. "I locked the door 2 days ago," she said in a shaky voice. "I haven't been able to open it since then." Herrera unlatched the lock. The door gave a long creak as it opened, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. A musty smell and something stronger wafted up from below. He turned on his flashlight, casting a beam of light over the old wooden stairs. He descended the steps slowly, with the flashlight in one hand and the other on his gun, more out of caution than fear. As he went down, the cold grew more intense. Once at the bottom, he illuminated the room. It was filled with old furniture, stacked boxes, and cobwebs hanging in the corners. Everything seemed normal, except for a growing sense that someone was watching him from the shadows. Then he heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from one of the basement walls. Herrera scanned the area with his flashlight, searching for the source of the noise. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. He moved closer to one of the walls where the sound seemed to originate, and noticed something unusual. A section of the wall appeared to have been recently patched. The plaster was fresher than the rest of the room. Herrera leaned in, and on closer inspection, he discovered a small crack in the wall. He took out his radio to report the finding. "This is Officer Herrera, requesting support at 241 Sycamore Avenue. Possible evidence of recent activity in the basement." As he waited for a response, he heard the scratching again, this time from inside the crack. Something or someone was on the other side. The tension grew as the noise continued. He decided not to wait any longer and requested reinforcements over the radio, this time with greater urgency. A few minutes later, backup arrived. With the proper equipment, they began investigating the area. When they tapped on the wall, they confirmed that there was a cavity behind it. They began to tear down the wall, and what they found shocked everyone. Behind the improvised wall was a small space where the body of a young woman lay, clearly murdered long ago. The bindings on her wrists were still visible. Herrera stepped back, feeling a knot in his stomach. Forensics arrived to process the scene. They discovered that the young woman had been missing for more than a year, and the marks on the wall indicated that she had been locked alive in that space before someone had sealed it to hide her. The woman who had made the call, seemingly terrified, never returned to the house. She disappeared without a trace and didn't respond to any attempts at contact. It seemed she had fled, leaving behind the horrors she might have witnessed. 2 weeks later, Herrera still couldn't get the sound of the scratching out of his head. Although the case was closed, something about that house deeply unsettled him. It was no longer about superstitions, but about real crimes and people hiding in the shadows. His nights on patrol were never the same again, knowing the real danger lay in those who concealed themselves in plain sight. Officer Marcos Hernandez always volunteered for the night shift. He liked the solitude, the quiet streets, the blanket of calm that covered the town when most people were asleep. But one night changed everything, and from that point on, the darkness brought a weight he could not ignore. It all started with a routine welfare check. An elderly woman named Mrs. Callahan hadn't been seen for several days, and her neighbors were worried. She lived alone in an old, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, one of those places everyone avoided due to its state of neglect. The neighbors said Mrs. Callahan was a bit eccentric, and some claimed she suffered from mental health issues. Hernandez didn't believe in rumors, so when he got the call, he drove to Mrs. Callahan's house without much thought, assuming it would be another case of a reclusive elderly woman who had simply isolated herself. Upon arrival, the house was cloaked in shadows, with the only light coming from a distant street lamp. The paint had long since peeled off, leaving the wood exposed to the elements. The grass was overgrown, and weeds invaded the path leading to the front door. Hernandez stepped out of his patrol car and approached the porch, his boots crunching over the gravel. He knocked on the door and the sound echoed through the stillness of the night, but there was no response. He waited a moment, then knocked again, this time calling out, "Mrs. Callahan, this is Officer Hernandez. I'm here to make sure you're all right." There was still no response. He sighed, looking around. The neighboring houses were far enough that no one could hear him. He decided to try the door handle, and to his surprise, it was unlocked. The door opened with a creak, revealing a dark, dusty interior. "Mrs. Callahan," he called again, stepping cautiously inside. The air inside was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of mold and something else, something that smelled rotten. Hernandez turned on his flashlight, illuminating the old dust-covered furniture and the faded wallpaper. The house seemed as though it hadn't been touched in years, frozen in time. He walked slowly down the hallway, his steps echoing on the old wooden floorboards. The further he went, the stronger the smell of decay became, mixed with a metallic tang as if something had died there a long time ago. He stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and from the darkness beyond, a cold air seeped through, colder than the rest of the house, making him feel even more uneasy. He swallowed, feeling a knot of discomfort form in his stomach. Taking a breath, he pushed the door open. Mrs. Callahan was sitting in an old armchair, facing away from him. Her white hair, once neat, was now tangled and dirty. Her body remained still, and the air in the room was so thick that Hernandez could almost feel it wrapping around him. "Mrs. Callahan," he said softly, stepping forward. "Are you all right?" There was no answer. Hernandez took another step, the creaking floorboards echoing through the house. When he was close enough, Mrs. Callahan slowly turned her head toward him, revealing her face. What he saw made the blood in his veins freeze. Her eyes were open, fixed on some invisible point ahead. Her skin was a sickly gray color, stretched taut over her bones, as if she had been sitting there for days. But the most disturbing part was her expression, a vacant, awkward smile as if her face had frozen that way. Hernandez stepped back instinctively, hand on his radio, but something in his mind stopped him. The scene made no sense. For what felt like an eternity, they stared at each other in silence, her twisted smile never fading, while her empty eyes pierced through him. Then, Mrs. Callahan began to make a noise. It wasn't a laugh nor a sigh, but a guttural sound, as if she were struggling to breathe or speak. Hernandez backed away, feeling that something was terribly wrong. He thought about calling to her again, but his intuition told him he needed to leave and request backup. It was clear that Mrs. Callahan needed medical help. With a mixture of fear and urgency, he made his way to the door, but it slammed shut behind him. Hernandez froze for a moment, unable to move, but then, with a surge of adrenaline, he pushed on the door, which this time opened without difficulty. He stumbled into the hallway, his breathing ragged and his heart pounding. The cold air in the house swirled around him as he ran for the exit. He didn't stop until he was outside, gasping for breath, his hands trembling. The following morning, they confirmed that Mrs. Callahan had died of natural causes, probably several days before he found her. What Hernandez had witnessed that night was the result of natural decomposition and cadaveric rigidity, a logical explanation that couldn't erase the disturbance he felt upon seeing her final expression. From that night on, Hernandez was never the same. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that unmoving face, and he couldn't help but wonder if the weight of loneliness and neglect in that house had made Mrs. Callahan's death even more cruel. Officer Marcos Rios had been on the force for over 10 years, and although he had seen disturbing things, nothing had prepared him for what happened that night on the old Colmenares Road. That road, deep in the forest, was known in town for being dangerous due to its poor maintenance and lack of lighting. Many accidents happened there, especially on dark and rainy nights. Rumor had it that there had been several violent incidents, and some said the area was frequented by criminals who took advantage of the desolate location. Marcos never believed in ghost stories, but the road's reputation bothered him enough to avoid patrolling it at night whenever he could. One summer night, everything changed when he received a call about an abandoned car on Colmenares Road, right in the middle of the night. Something in the chill of the call disturbed him, though he tried to ignore it as he drove to the location. Fog began to form around him as he arrived, shrouding the trees and making the road appear darker and more twisted than usual. When he got to the scene, his headlights illuminated an old sedan, haphazardly parked on the shoulder, half in a ditch. The emergency lights flashed dimly, casting unsettling shadows over the trees. Marcos stopped his patrol car and turned off the engine. The only sound around him was the faint rustling of leaves moved by the wind. He took out his flashlight and stepped out of the car. The air was thick, almost sticky, with the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. He cautiously approached the sedan, shining his flashlight around. The driver's door was open, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. "Hello?" he called out, his voice bouncing off the darkness that surrounded him. "Police, is anyone here?" There was no response, just the echo of his own voice which seemed to die among the trees. Marcos shone his flashlight inside the car. The keys were still in the ignition and a purse rested on the passenger seat. Something immediately caught his attention. The windshield was covered in greasy, dark handprints as if someone had desperately tried to get out. His stomach tightened. He stepped back from the car, scanning the trees with his flashlight. A movement caught his eye, making him turn sharply. In the distance between the trees, there was a figure, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, completely still. "Hey!" Marcos shouted. "Police, stop right there!" The figure didn't respond or move. It remained perfectly still, as if observing him from within the forest. Marcos moved forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun on his belt. But just as he was about to reach it, the figure disappeared into the trees without a sound, as if it had never been there. Marcos cursed under his breath, his pulse racing. He took out his radio to request backup, but static flooded the channel. The approaching storm must have interfered with the signal. He was alone. He scanned the ground with his flashlight and noticed a trail of footprints leading into the woods, as if someone had run from the car. He knew he had to follow them. It was his job. But a feeling of unease settled in his chest as he stepped into the trees. Each step he took seemed to lead him deeper into an even more oppressive darkness. The breeze had stopped, leaving the air stagnant and heavy, and the silence was absolute. The footprints led him to a small clearing. There, the ground seemed softer, as if it had been recently disturbed. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine as he examined the area. In the center of the clearing, a figure was crouched with its back to him. It appeared to be a woman, her hair tangled and her body hunched forward. "Ma'am?" Marcos called, moving forward slowly, his hand on the holster of his gun. "I'm a police officer. I'm here to help you." The figure didn't respond or move. She remained hunched, her breathing barely audible. Marcos took another cautious step forward, his heart pounding. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around," he repeated firmly. Without warning, the woman spun around abruptly. Her face bore obvious signs of abuse and dehydration, as if she had been lost in the forest for days. Her eyes were wide open, and though she wasn't fully conscious, she let out a weak, desperate cry. Marcos stepped back instinctively. The woman, clearly in shock, stumbled toward him, seeking help. She wasn't a threat, but someone who urgently needed medical assistance. He quickly radioed for an ambulance and backup. Although the signal was weak, he managed to make contact. He tried to calm the woman as they waited, offering her water from his canteen and assuring her that everything would be all right. When the ambulance arrived, the woman was taken to the hospital, where doctors confirmed she had been lost for days, disoriented and dehydrated. Marcos felt a sense of relief but also a lingering unease. The Colmenares Road remained a dangerous place, not because of ghosts, but because of something real. The isolation, the darkness, and the loneliness that could make any situation turn deadly.